You are entertaining too limited ideas of the work for this time. You must take broader views. The message will go in power to all parts of the world, to Oregon, to Europe, to Australia, to the islands of the sea.
The grand narrative of who we are as Adventists is intimately knit with our history and the influence of Ellen White in shaping the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Australia and the South Pacific. We are a people entrusted with truth, and while this truth can oftentimes be lost in the retelling of stories, it can always be found again in the preservation of our history. The circumstances that led to Mrs. White journeying to Australia and her devotion to creating a church establishment, despite the various struggles she faced, reveals to us the significance of our message and the importance of our mission in sharing the truth to the world. Mrs. White faced many struggles in her journey to Australia, as she was not only a woman in ministry, but she was also an advocate for racial justice and was considered progressive and outspoken about her radical ideas. As a woman taking religious leadership role, Ellen White faced a lot of criticism in her early ministry. She was scrutinised and her character was questioned. She records one instance of this, saying,
"My brother wrote to me and said, 'I beg of you, do not disgrace the family. I will do anything for you if you will not go out as a preacher.'" "Disgrace the family?" I replied. "Can it disgrace the family for me to preach Christ and Him crucified?"
Ellen White's views and activism was progressive for her time and stirred up some serious opposition, even within her own church. She was an outspoken advocate for racial justice and actively appealed for more to be done in the southern schools for black students and for more Adventist work in the southern mission fields.
Many Sabbath keepers are not right before God in their political views. These brethren cannot receive the approval of heaven while they lack sympathy for the oppressed colored race.
Her passion and mission for all racial groups and her commentary on spiritually charged political matters was not well received by the church in America. Her ideas were radical for her time and inflamed opposition. This was one of the reasons she was pressured to leave America by the General Conference.
Some who are bearing responsibilities in America seem to be very persistent that my special work should go to Europe and Australia.
She was hesitant to come to Australia because her path was not yet made clear to her by God.
I have not special light to leave America for this far-off country. Nevertheless, if I knew it was the voice of God, I would go.
Without a direct answer from God, she travelled to Australia anyway, journeying with the faith that God would close the door if this path did not accomplish His will. She set sail from San Francisco to Sydney on the SS Alameda, with a brief stop in Samoa, arriving in Sydney on the 8th of December 1891. Not long after she arrived in Australia, she was bedridden with rheumatic fever which left her in constant pain and limited her ability to work. Her health continued to worsen over the following 8 months, but during this time of suffering, she turned to God for comfort and strength. Despite it being a time of terrible pain, she reflected,
I am thankful that I had this experience because I am better acquainted with my precious Savior. All through my sickness, His love, His tender compassion was my comfort, my continual consolation.
Despite her illness, Ellen continued to write while she lay in her bed. Even her ailment would not impede her work, and once she had finally recovered, she set off around Australia and the South Pacific to continue God's work in sharing truth to the world.
She moved to Melbourne in 1892 and stayed there for 2 years. While in Melbourne, she set up the Bible School for Missionary Work, which opened on August 24th, 1892. She travelled around Australia, and it was no easy feat, as she had to rely on horse and carriage or train to get from place to place. She spent almost all of 1893 in the North Island of New Zealand, then returned to Sydney on December 22 before heading down to Melbourne to attend Australia's first camp meeting on December 29th. During these travels, she attended various church meetings and established churches, gave communities spiritual guidance, and gave public lectures to large audiences. She journeyed to Tasmania, South Australia, and Queensland. In 1894, she came to Sydney with the intent for looking for land on which she could start a school. And in 1895, she settled in a rural township of Cooranbong, which would go on to become the central hub of Adventist education and spiritual ministry in the South Pacific.
We have found ourselves on missionary soil, in a land where there were but few Sabbath keepers and scarcely any facilities. We made it our first work to unite with the faithful laborers there in an effort to open the field as rapidly as possible. The Lord gave us access to the hearts of the people and blessed our efforts to save souls. Churches were organized and meeting houses were built.
What started out as a setback in her ministry, the objection and resistance to Ellen White, and her radical views and passionate zeal for God's love and truth became an avenue through which God would spread His word and His truth to the whole of the South Pacific. Neither opposition, hardship, or sickness could prevent God's ministry from spreading throughout the South Pacific. A ministry which continues boldly to today.
From the light given me in regard to the location and building up of our school interests, I know that it is the purpose of God that these institutions should be established at a distance from the city.
On July the 7th, 1895, Ellen White arrived in Cooranbong, the town where she would have a lasting legacy. However, on this crisp morning, she was greeted by swathes of uncleared bushland and dirt tracks. It was far from the bustling centre of ministry Ellen had seen in her vision. Nevertheless, Ellen was determined to see it succeed, determined to manifest her interest in the school enterprise and her confidence in the Avondale estate. She selected 40 acres and purchased the land, making Cooranbong her home. Within a few weeks, a portion of her family were living in tents on the land, which she called Sunnyside. These tents were erected on the property with temporary kitchens and living quarters within. The beds they had to sleep in were just thin mats, and the thick wax cloth of the tents let off a terrible stench in the heat. Nevertheless to say, the living conditions were barely tolerable, and for a 68-year-old woman, this wouldn't have been a very easy lifestyle.
The building of their home was a high priority, and to do the job, the family hired an Adventist builder they had met in Tasmania, J.G. Shannon, who took on the project for only 2 shillings a day, which today would equate to around $5 a day. While the home was built, Ellen focused her attention on 2 projects: travelling to various camp meetings and establishing the Sunnyside Orchard. Though the house was not yet finished, Ellen insisted on beginning her orchard, claiming that it shouldn't wait another year. There'd been doubts about whether she could grow anything at all in this climate. With help from an orchardist, Mr. Mosley, Ellen planted several kinds of trees brought from Sydney using a unique planting method still recognised today. The plants thrived in the hot Australian climate, and soon the orchard was brimming with her signature fruits: mandarins, oranges and passion fruit. Her orchard was open to all, and she allowed all workers and travellers to take freely from the fruit that was grown. Sister White was the very soul of hospitality. Visitors were always welcome and no one left her home hungry. Not even a professional tramp, of which Australia had a large number in those days. In December 1895, the house was finally ready for the family to move in. On Christmas Day, the cheapest day for train fares, they travelled to Kurumbong and entered their home for the first time. Eager to begin writing The Desire of Ages and assist in establishing the local school, Ellen White completed the house with far fewer rooms than wished. However, issues with pests convinced her to plaster the home and expand it to provide a home for her workers, relatives, and a constant flow of guests.
From the moment Sunnyside was complete, there were guests clamouring to visit, which left the family little time to settle in. This also meant that chores were in plentiful supply. Sunnyside was a hive of activity, and the work required to maintain it was immense.
Water had to be drawn from the well to supply the home. The orchard had to be maintained. All clothes and dishes were washed by hand. Inside, the floors had to be swept and mopped, the rooms cobwebbed, dusted and aired. Even the mattress had to be laid flat again each day. Add to that the care for the animals, and you can begin to understand the immense effort it was for the family to care for their own property on top of all the cares they did for the community.
The story of Sunnyside's establishment is one of resilience and courage. For an elderly woman to buy land that required so much work and commit herself to growing and maintaining produce others said would die in days tells us a lot about Ellen's character. A bush-covered lot was cleared, cultivated and nurtured through delays, deluges and trials into a place of continued blessing for generations to come.
A distinct work is assigned to every Christian. God requires everyone to be a worker in his vineyard. You are to take up the work that has been placed in your charge and do it faithfully.
If there was a principle that Ellen White embodied whilst in Australia, it would have been that of Christian service. It is stated that she always had more than 10 people at her table for every evening meal. She was always on the go and never seemed to stop. When she'd complete one community project, she started on another, and then another, and then another. And because of this, Kurumbong was never the same because of her influence.
On April 28, 1897, the Avondale School opened with a staff of 6, 10 students, and a visionary dream.
We must all work earnestly and intelligently to do the utmost to make this school as God would have it. No man's notions are to be brought in here.
But a school wasn't the only Christian institution that Mrs. White founded. There was a need to educate the ministers and gospel workers of the future. And so the Australasian Missionary College was built in 1897. Mrs. White had helped to lay the foundations and gave $500 to financially support the students through their first and second term. She was of the belief that this college would have a great impact on the community. In her time, Ellen White established schools, colleges, factories, and other large institutions. However, while she lived in Kurumbong, she was not revered as she is now. She lived a life of simple generosity towards her community, and to many, this had a greater impact on their lives than any institution could.
Ellen White's customary exercise of walking took her to many places around Kurumbong. But one place she frequented regularly was a clearing in the bush where the brush had been swept away. Here, sticks and debris would be piled up and set alight, and the bonfire's smoke and flickering light would attract the attention of those who had been eagerly awaiting the occasion. She would sit and wait as children slowly began to emerge from the trees and take a seat around the fire, looking earnestly up at the woman who had become their teacher and friend. On those days, Ellen's stories about Jesus and the Bible would captivate those children for hours on end. and each would end up going away from there with a new love for God. One witness wrote that Mrs. White was the soul of hospitality. All who came were able to freely take from her orchard, and none were left hungry. The spirit of giving was infused in every action. Her orchards, her bread ovens, her very table was open to the struggling, and she never ignored a call from God to help someone. One of the best examples of Ellen White's impact on someone's life is the story of a man whose family was on the brink. His wife was dead, and he had children to feed, but his money and supplies were dried up. On this particular day, he was so worried about what he was going to do when it was time for dinner, and he would have nothing when they heard the sound of a carriage pulling up. He went out of his home and found a man there with some supplies and money. Of course, the man was surprised and overjoyed and asked, "Who sent this?" Instead of claiming the glory for herself, Ellen White instructed her helper to say, "The Lord."
The members of the church are not all called to labor in foreign lands, but all have a part to act in the great work of giving light to the world. There is work for every mind and for every hand, all that would do the work of Christ. Our coming here to Australia was at a time when the banks were broken and means so very scarce that we not only have to give the word of life, but largely to provide food for the hungry and also to clothe those who need clothing. It has been a time of various poverty. I do hope and pray for the Lord to provide us with the necessities of life, that we can divide with the worthy, needy poor.
Ellen White arrived in Australia in the midst of an economic depression that hit the Cooranbong area especially hard. The population of Cooranbong had declined to as little as 206 people by 1891. In 1895, Ellen White moved to Cooranbong and stayed there until her departure back to America in 1900. The economic depression continued in that area until the Adventist Church bought 1,500 acres of land on the north bank of Dora Creek. Here, they constructed Avondale School for Christian Workers in 1897 and Sanitarium Health Food Company in 1900, largely due to the influence of Ellen White. These institutions provided work and income for many people in the area and are still prominent features in the community of Cooranbong today. In 1894, Ellen left Melbourne and went to Sydney, where she helped in the search for land to build a school.
Most diligent search has been made for a tract of land of several hundred acres on which to locate the school, so that the students may have an opportunity to till the soil, to grow vegetables and fruit. These would go far towards sustaining them, and they would have a chance to school their children.
In Ellen's June 28, 1898 manuscript, Selection of a School Land at Cooranbong, she tells of a dream she had of a neat cut furrow that had been ploughed 20 centimetres deep and 1.8 metres long. This was to be the site where they built Avondale School. However, there would be many difficulties to overcome in the building process, in particular, a lack of funds.
Our faith is being tested and tried. In our endeavor to establish a school in Cooranbong, our path has not been smooth. A school is to be built and a church erected, but we are brought into straight places for lack of means.
On October 2nd, 1896, Ellen laid the foundation cornerstone, and on April 28, 1897, Avondale School was opened. With only 6 staff and 10 students, she exhorted these members saying,
"We must all work earnestly and intelligently to do the utmost to make this school as God would have it. No man's notions are to be brought in here."
Indeed, with its small beginnings and lack of resources, Avondale School would need to totally rely on God's providence to grow and flourish. Enrolments quickly grew to 80 within the first 4 months of being open, and the campus had to be extended to accommodate the students. Shortly thereafter, Avondale established an orchard and a dairy, a printing press, and many other industries such as the sanitarium factory on the site. Ellen White believed in raising a generation that would be able to serve God in any career they chose, aiming to give students a spiritual education as well as practical skills.
Ellen considered medical missionary work an important means of sharing the gospel to people in need.
The medical missionary work is the gospel in practice, working as God's helping hand. And the medical missionary work is to open the door of entrance to the truth in many places. When God's remedies, sunshine, pure air, water, and good food are used, there will be far fewer deaths and a far greater number of cures.
Sydney Adventist Hospital began in mid-1896 as a 7-room cottage in Ashfield, Sydney. By 1897, they needed a bigger space. Alfred Semmons contacted Ellen White saying they needed money to rent another home, and she sent him £25, which today would be equivalent to about $4,500. By 1900, they were running the hospital across 3 rented homes. In the same year, they bought land at Mooroonga on the outskirts of Sydney to build a new hospital. The new premises were to be known as the Sydney Sanitarium and Hospital, and officially opened on January 1, 1903, with room for 70 patients. On June 10, 1973, a new 10-storey hospital was opened on the same land and called Sydney Adventist Hospital. Its establishment led to other health homes opening across Australia and New Zealand. When Ellen first arrived in Cooranbong, the closest doctor was in Newcastle, which was 40 kilometres away. Ellen's nurse, Sarah McEntonfur, would treat the sick for free, and patients were often brought to stay at Sunnyside. There was a great need for a health institution, and Ellen was heavily involved in the plans for building this institution. She held fast to the stance that the building must have sunshine, despite protests that it would mean it would be a skewer to the road. In response, she simply said, "A skewer, let it be." So Avondale Health Retreat was opened in 1899. Ellen White was passionate about spreading the health message and saw the need to build a factory to make healthy foods available to the community. The factory would be situated next to Avondale School and connected to other institutes. Ellen said,
God has instructed me that parents can find work in this industry and send their children to school. The establishment of the health food factory has called for means which we do not have, but we have advanced in these lines because we dared not delay. If we had waited for piles of money to be laid down in our sight, where would have been our faith?
The sanitarium now sells the 2 top breakfast cereals in Australia, Weet-Bix and Up and Go. The sanitarium's construction inspired other buildings such as the Health Retreat in Cooranbong in 1899 and the health food cafes in Sydney in 1902. The Adventist Church membership across Australia and New Zealand upon Mrs. White's arrival in 1891 was only 655 in total across 10 churches. By the time she left in 1900, the membership had grown to 2,086 across 47 churches and 14 companies. Today, the South Pacific Division has over 2,000 churches with over 400,000 members. In Australia, there are over 400 churches with over 60,000 members. It is needless to say, Ellen White has a massive impact on Australia and the South Pacific in establishing churches and various ministries. Ellen White left her Sunnyside home to return to America in August 1900. Her departure was deeply felt by many new members in Australia. During her 9 years here, she impacted many people with her kind generosity and care. Thomas Russell, a businessman in Cooranbong, said at the time, "Mrs. White's presence in our village would be greatly missed. The widow and the orphan found in her a helper. She sheltered, clothed and fed those in need. And where gloom was cast, her presence brought sunshine." Ellen said,
Few, however, are familiar either with the self-sacrificing efforts that brought into existence the publishing house, the school, and the sanitarium in Australia.
Ellen White encountered many challenges in coming to Australia. Health frailties, poverty, the lack of finances and scepticism. Yet her efforts left a lasting impact for generations to come.
The greatest want of the world is the want of men. Men who will not be bought or sold. Men who in their inmost souls are true and honest. Men who do not fear to call sin by its right name. Men whose conscience is as true to duty as the needle to the pole. Men who will stand for the right, though the heavens fall.
In the days of Ellen White, many were willing to stand up and make bold statements about their beliefs. This was an era of civil war, when states all took a stand for or against slavery. Ellen White saw the beginning of segregation laws and the women's movements, and could confidently claim she lived in a time of activism.
Fast forward to the 21st century, and we too are experiencing an era of social upheaval. Pandemics, restrictions, gender identity, abortion, climate change, racism, mental health, injustice, war and feminism are plastered across our screens each night. It seems everyone is passionate about something. Many today, especially our youth, are gripped by the desire to protest inequalities and speak out for the rights of those in need. But while this may seem a modern trend, 200 years earlier, Ellen White was doing much the same.
After leaving the established Society of America for the new Australian colonies, Ellen found the fledgling states in especially poor condition. Arriving in Melbourne during the financial decline, government figures report that up to 10,000 children in the city alone were neglected and homeless. Mothers reported giving up their babies to baby farms out of sheer desperation, hoping they'd be cared for enough to survive infancy. The rich colonists regarded the situation as God's judgment visited upon the working class for rejecting him, leaving many to have a cruel image of God.
In this country I have found destitution and poverty everywhere, and had not means to relieve the distressed, to clothe the naked, to take the youth who are too poor to help themselves and place them in schools, and to help the churches in building houses of worship. We should have left this field long ago, for it would be useless to attempt to do anything hampered on every side.
But despite her frustration, Ellen's compassion won out. Though she felt helpless, her strong beliefs about helping those in poverty led her to give what she had, $1,000 to help some students get an education, and a further $2,000 to help other individuals in distress.
After establishing herself at Sunnyside, Ellen set about ensuring their self-sufficiency. She had lived through many periods of scarcity. In setting up her extensive orchard of around 500 fruit trees ensured there was plenty of food to go around. Parcels of food were always leaving Sunnyside, bound for the tables of the sick and starving. As her secretaries recorded in private letters, everyone was welcome to take of her produce, and this was especially important to the homeless, of which there were many in those days. But poverty wasn't the only cause close to her heart. Ellen was especially vocal about the treatment of others. Having lived through the Civil War, she knew well how poorly men could treat one another and resolved to welcome everyone. She comments,
"It has become fashionable to look down on the poor and upon the colored race in particular. But Jesus, the Master, was poor, and he sympathizes with the poor, the discarded, the oppressed, and declares that every insult shown to them is as if shown to himself. You have no license from God to exclude the colored people from your places of worship. Treat them as Christ's property, which they are, just as much as yourselves."
When we think of the amazing work that Ellen did in Australia and her love for its people, we often forget that she never intended to come here. When called, she was uncertain about coming, for she knew that she was needed in America. The leaders of the time were making crucial decisions about the church's identity and future, and Ellen's bold, truthful and compassionate statements made many feel uneasy, and to have her far away eased their worries. Thankfully, God made incredible things come from the move, and Ellen grew to love this country and the Pacific. But we should never forget that Ellen came here because her passion refused to let her be quiet. Today, Adventists all across the globe are tasked with continuing this special work of being a force of kindness and truth in a world full of social change. This is a big task, but we are not left without advice on how to achieve this.
Many feel it would be a great privilege to visit the scenes of Christ's life on earth, to walk where he trod, to look upon the lake beside which he loved to teach, and the hills and valleys on which his eyes so often rested. But we need not go to Nazareth, to Capernaum, or to Bethany in order to walk in the steps of Jesus. We shall find his footprints beside the sickbed, in the hovels of poverty, in the crowded alleys of the great city, and in every place where there are human hearts in need of consolation. In doing as Jesus did on earth, we shall walk in his steps.
May we please have an apple?
Sure, help yourself. Girls, help yourself.
Thank you.
Anyone for a cookie?
Yes, please.
Children are precious in the sight of God. In order that the work may go forward in all its branches, God calls for youthful vigor, zeal, and courage. He has chosen the youth to aid in the advancement of his cause. Young men and women are invited to give God the strength of their youth, that through the exercise of their powers, through keen thoughts and vigorous actions, they may bring glory to him and salvation to their fellow men.
Ellen White was always passionate about the youth of the church, and that passion was not only in her writings, but evident in her everyday life. Sunnyside was always filled with children and young people, and even though she was a very busy woman, she always had time to share Jesus with these eager listeners.
Ellen White's passion for young people is not only seen in her extensive writings about Christian education and the raising of children, but we can also see her love and care for them through various interactions. Ellen would often go into the bushland surrounding Sunnyside and set up a campfire. Seeing the smoke, children from all around would come to sit by her and listen to her stories. It's no wonder she soon gained the title Auntie Ellen. Writing about these children, she noted,
Instead of putting fashion's shackles upon them, let them be free like the lambs, to play in the sweet, fresh sunlight. Point them to shrubs and to flowers, the lowly grass and the lofty trees, and let them become familiar with their beautiful, varied, delicate forms. Teach them to see the wisdom and love of God in such places.
The children Ellen interacted with clearly adored her. But what do today's youth think about Ellen White? You might be surprised to find that there is much apathy and confusion amongst the young people of our church.
Growing up in the Adventist community, I thought of Ellen White as a cold and conservative, distant figure. And since learning more about her, I found out that she was a pretty cool woman. You know, she was a social activist and a woman in a man's world, and she just helped everyone around her.
From my experience as a tour guide at Sunnyside and my own personal experience, I know that one of the biggest barriers between young people and Ellen White is lack of knowledge and just education. Most kids I meet know very little about Ellen, or the bits that they do know are actually incorrect. And so getting education out there about who she was and the type of life she led is key to getting young people to know Ellen as a person.
My experience of Ellen White started very young because I grew up in the church, and I always thought of her as a conservative person and just basically someone who made a lot of rules that I had to follow. But as I've learned about her life through working at Heritage, I've learned that she was a very community-focused person, and she was always about serving people, handing out food, and that's made me respect her a lot as a person.
Making Ellen White relevant to the youth of today is of great concern to those who daily interact with these young minds. For our teachers in Adventist schools, this is of particular importance.
We have an army of youth today who can do much if they are properly directed and encouraged. We want our children to believe the truth. We want them to be blessed of God. Let all be so trained that they may rightly represent the truth, giving reason of the hope that is within them, and honoring God in any branch of the work where they are qualified to labor.
Today, the legacy of Ellen's time in Australia still stands as a monument to her belief in the power of educating and inspiring the youth. I'm here at Avondale University, right next to where Ellen laid a foundation stone for Bethel Hall in 1897. This place was built to provide the necessary courses in teaching, business, ministry and mission studies for the advancement of the Adventist Church. Today, the university is top tier and ranked first in Australia for many of its courses. But what continues to make this place as incredible as it is for students like me is that the educational philosophy it was founded upon puts faith before grades.
Even though Currumbong was almost a ghost town in the 1890s, Ellen dreamt of establishing an educational institution for gospel workers. In 1893, inspectors were sent to scout for possible locations, and against all odds, Currumbong was chosen to house the college. Leading Adventists drew up plans for the site, leaving ample space for the orchards and fields needed to ensure the college would be self-sufficient. Outside of physical plans, much discussion was had about the type of education and character building which would take place.
True education means more than the pursuit of a certain course of study. It means more than a preparation for the life that now is. It has to do with the whole being and with the whole period of existence possible to man. It prepares the student for the joy of service in this world and for the higher joy of wider service in the world to come.
Through the legacy and writings of Ellen White, young people across the globe are encouraged to be forces of good in their communities and to spread the story of Jesus. Filled and energised by the Holy Spirit, Adventist youth can be true game changers.
With such an army of workers as our youth, rightly trained, might furnish, how soon the message of a crucified, risen, and soon coming Saviour might be carried to the whole world.
Hi, David Riley is my name, and I am standing beside a 1923 Citroën motor vehicle. This is the model of vehicle that was the first car to ever do a complete lap, a complete circumnavigation of the continent of Australia. What you may not be aware of is that first ever lap of Australia was done by two Seventh-day Adventist missionaries who were students at Carmel College over there in Perth, Western Australia. Neville Westwood and Greg Davies, back in 1925, borrowed one of their brother's cars and took off from Perth up to Darwin. They sold books along the way to towns and cattle stations. They overcame significant obstacles, including running out of fuel a number of times, having to walk to the nearest town, having to overcome a number of punches to their tyres where they would have to stuff grass and even cattle hide into their tyres. They were pulled across rivers by local Aboriginal people. They even travelled on the notorious Madman's Track up to Broome. And after over 2 months of travel, they finally made it into Darwin. They knocked on doors. They shared the Adventist faith. After they finished their work, they climbed back into their car and thought, wouldn't it be fun if we travelled right round Australia? Nobody had ever travelled around Australia in a car before. In August of 2025, in 2 years' time, this vehicle will be leaving Carmel College there in Perth, Western Australia, following the exact same cattle station tracks that these two young missionaries did 100 years ago, and look at doing a faithful reenactment of this incredible trip of mission and pioneering spirit that these two young fellas did 100 years ago.